Hello, welcome to my guide for FTB Skies Expert. It's available on the FTB Launcher. If you want to get right to the guide, skip to the appropriate chapter, but if you aren't looking for something specific, I'd watch this part anyway, as you might be confused by some things if you don't. So, what exactly do I mean by guide? Well, this isn't a developer playthrough in the same sense as Integration by Parts DX. For starters, I'm not exactly a main progression developer. I just fix simpler bugs, provide balance feedback, and draw some textures. This is meant to guide you through the mod pack and provide you with insight that might not be readily apparent. Of course, this pack is a fresh release, so there are still a number of bugs out there, as well as balancing issues. I'll be ignoring them and not even mentioning them, under the assumption that they are or will be fixed in most cases. This is meant to be reflective of how the pack should be, not how it happens to be in the current moment, as even though we had a long time for testing, there are always last-minute issues that cause major problems. Now I'd like to talk about how the actual playthrough will go. I'm going to cheat. A lot. My reason for this is I wanted to find a way to both provide informative material and keep playing on my main playthrough world without burning out. I also want to make sure I get videos out in a reasonable time frame. You hopefully won't be able to tell of the cheating I've done, as I'll still be building all of the relevant infrastructure and will still treat things relative to how important they are when playing. This also makes recording easier, as I'll know for a fact what footage is important and what's not, with no breaks for having forgotten to stock up on one material and re-record. Of course, if something drastic does change, I'll have no choice but to make an addendum for it, but this is overall what I feel is a good compromise. You can pick any map you like. I went with the Sakura Grove this time, as I did the FTB Sky Island on my main world. Take a minute to get acclimated to your surroundings, assuming you're using one of the more complex islands, of course. The minimalist island won't have very much to find on it. Anyway, now that you've gotten a look around at your surroundings, you might happen to notice the Enderman walking around. Every time one of them spawns, it'll show you it in chat. This is only until you get your first Ender Pearl. You'll need one early game, and they're not a guaranteed drop from an already not exactly common mob. But let's not worry about those yet. If you've read the quest book after you get a bunch of checkmarks done, you'll see that you need rocks and clumps of dirt. This is how you get your beginning cobblestone and dirt. By holding shift and right clicking, you'll pick up either a clump of dirt or a pebble. It's a random chance which one you get. However, you can filter which one you get by holding it in your offhand. This means that if you need a lot of clumps of dirt, you can get lots of dirt. And if you need a lot of cobblestone, you can get a lot of cobblestone. This makes farming early cobblestone much easier than it would be otherwise. Let's review events while I'm here. For starters, we have the Amethyst event. This will allow diamond blocks to be converted into budding amethyst. Then we have the Loot Bees. This spawns loot bees, which drop items, but you'll have to make sure you capture it so the items in the bee don't get away. Then we have the Chest event, which spawns mimics from regular chests placed in the world. The Crow event, which spawns crows on nearby grass, as it says. The Endermite event, which sometimes allows budding amethysts to spawn possessed endermites, which is how you get endstone. Frogs and squids are just where you have a frog or a squid spawn nearby. The stick event will randomly place a stick in your inventory, and they have all sorts of hilarious jokes as their names. The tea event is just the server saying that it'll get a cup of tea. It doesn't really do much else. The villager event will spawn a villager. I would recommend keeping this one on. Same with the Wandering Trader, it'll make sure the Wandering Trader with its custom trades spawn. The Slime event will randomly have a slime spawn, and then the Goat event spawns a goat, which is a little dangerous, but you know. The other thing that you can make with these clumps of soil and rocks is gravel. 3 of these together in the crafting grid makes flint. This is how you're going to make a flint hatchet, the first tool that becomes available to you, primarily for cutting wood, of course. The other thing you're going to need is a stick. Now, you could go around punching all the leaves hoping you get one to drop. It is possible, but you could also just claim a quest reward and get some free sticks anyway. You start with plenty of bone meal so you can grow some trees right away, And since Ulti-Mine is enabled, you can just cut those entire things down at once. Do be careful, because it will take a durability if it starts breaking all the leaves as well as the logs. Now, to get the most out of our logs in the early game, and just in general, you're going to want to use the saw that you get as a quest reward. It has unbreaking and mending on it, meaning it'll last you as long as it needs to. And like most mod packs, you go right into making a crafting table, and in this case we can upgrade to a crafting station, which retains its inventory if you've never used one before. Then, we can craft a furnace, and this will allow us to get started on charcoal, which will be useful for torches, of course, you know, typical skyblock stuff. However, it's much quicker to smelt all of this up because you can make piles of logs that turn into a charcoal block for the time of one item taking to smelt. I know that sometimes with all the bugs it might not look like we go out of our way to make sure there's a good amount of quality of life in here, but I promise you there's a lot more than you might think at first glance. Much like integration by parts wasn't meant to be overly grindy, neither is FTB Skies. There's a lot of boss type chapters where you will have to do a lot of that grind stuff, but that's more to encourage the automation of those things. A lot of the regular progression is a lot better than it looks. Speaking of things everyone's done in a skyblock mod pack, hammer cobble to get gravel, gravel to get sand, and sand to get dust. Nothing you haven't seen before. Each has its own sifting tables, so be sure to get a variety, but focus on gravel. And since it happened while it was in the middle of me recording that clip, if you get this red warning text on screen, be ready. A quantum goat is going to spawn, and it can and will knock you off the edge if you're not careful. It can drop dimensional shards or diamonds though, which are very helpful to have early game. So I'd recommend keeping all of the events on until you really get tired of having to deal with their consequences. To get started with sifting, you'll of course need a sifter and a mesh. Meshes are going to require string. Now most of the islands have a pretty fast way of getting string. The FTB Sky Island has flax growing on it, while the Sakura Grove has cobwebs scattered about. Pick whatever fits your island, you might have to grow it. And now that you can craft things like stone swords, dealing with the Enderman is much easier. Note that we do have some of the log crafting shortcuts that Quark adds, such as sticks and chests. This means you don't have to spend nearly as much time micromanaging plank crafting. Once you craft up your sifter, mesh, and hand crank, claim the cogwheel you get as a quest reward, and then you can place your stuff down. You put gravel in by dropping it in from the top, or by putting it in through a hopper or some other item insertion method. The hand crank has a fairly high SU capacity, that's stress units, get used to that if you haven't used Create before. And then you can also tile these sifters by placing them next to one another, as the gears in the center allow them to connect. You can run as many as you have the stress units to support. Of course, in the early game you're not going to get more than 4 of these at a time, but I'd say it's at least useful to get all of them running and making the most of your early stress units. The string mesh doesn't have the biggest table of possible drops, so you're not really going to get all that much, but once we upgrade in a minute, we'll have access to a lot more things. This isn't the only trick I have for the sifter though. If you use just one plank, you can upgrade your cogwheel into a large cogwheel. This means that you can stick it on a diagonal block to one of your sifters, and it'll double the speed at which they rotate, which means it's doubling the sifting speed. This is what I mean about making the most of your stress units. There are lots of things you can do if you know the tips and tricks to make it go by just that much quicker. If you're going to start hammering up a lot of things early on, especially for the dust you're going to need for Apatite for andesite alloy, you're going to want to make sure to use Ulti-Mine to mine it as fast as possible. Now with these andesite meshes, the drop tables are going to change, and you'll get coal and lapis from your gravel, for example. In addition, you'll get other resources from the other blocks, of course. Now, another trick is that if you claim the steak and potatoes reward, this isn't just a food that gives you a lot of hunger back. This gives you a special buff that prevents your hunger from going down. This means that you can hold the hand crank for as long as you want and you won't lose hunger. This is something you should definitely capitalize on. We happen to have Spice of Life Carrot Edition, so make sure to eat all the different foods you get so you can increase your hearts. The next thing of note we're going to do is something that will save us a lot of time on resource collection. I'm sure you're tired of gathering pebbles by now. Well, I'm not. I don't think it's nearly as grindy as others do, but in any case, we're going to optimize this. By using some andesite casings created with strip logs and andesite alloy, I can make a mechanical press. This is going to go over a basin, which also uses andesite alloy to craft. If we put 9 cobblestone into the basin, and then run the mechanical press on it, it will create a compacted cobblestone. This is going to be an item in which we can get lots of cobble from it just by right-clicking it, much like the rocks and clumps of soil from earlier. The difference here is that you get cobblestone blocks per click instead of rocks, which makes it a lot faster to create resources from. It will decay over time. I believe it's about 10 minutes, but that's plenty long to fill up a drawer or something, and if you ever need more, you can just compact another one. This won't work with any source of automatic clicking, like a deployer, but what it will do is allow you to gather your initial batch of materials much faster. It greatly speeds up early game processing. There's also a variant of this for dirt and gravel, so be sure to make one of each and try to fill up a drawer. A drawer is just a lot of wood, and that's not really that difficult to get a hold of at this stage. Remember that mimic event? Well, now that I have some regular vanilla chests placed down, a mimic spawned. They could drop any different type of artifact, and there are some really good ones in there, so I'd recommend at least holding on to them for a while. Again, you can disable these events at any time in the quest menu, or with a command. They disable per player, so don't worry about ruining it for other people on the server if you are on one. The iron shards you're getting from sifting gravel can be turned into iron substrate. This can then be processed in the mechanical press. You might want to put a depot under the press to put items on it. You could throw them under it, but it's much easier and neater to just put them on the depot. Most recipes that use iron ingots by default now use iron plates. This was done not to make things harder, but to actually make them easier for the early game, because you don't get access to iron ingots for a while. This means we can make things like armor and weaponry and buckets using all these iron plates. Because gravel is so abundant due to the infinite supply of it that you have, you might want to get as many iron shards as you can and fully kit yourself out, or at least make a few pieces of gear so that you don't die when you eventually have to fight some mobs, which is what I'm working on right now. While we already have our ender pearl from the enderman, which was easily cheesed using the water, you will have to kill a zombie at least to get an earth shard. A little earth shard combined with an ender pearl will make an endless witchgate pearl, which is how you get your first redstone. I didn't get that many mobs to spawn, but a zombie is all I need, because thanks to a quest reward, we're guaranteed one raw small earth shard drop. That means that I can get started with the endless witchgate pearl when I want to. While I tend to ignore quest rewards a fair bit more than I should, I would definitely recommend claiming them as long as you have storage space. There are some really good and useful things in there, and just things that help speed along progression. More importantly, I've made a new setup for sifting things. It's not the most automated thing ever. I mean, it literally requires the one source of power that is 100% reliant on me to use it, but nevertheless, we're going to be able to sift things much more efficiently. By using the chests and hoppers, I can simply automate the input and output of whatever I get from these sifters early on. Before I get into fighting witches though, we're going to fight something a lot more dangerous. Chickens. By using some wheat and making a chicken palooza pearl, we can get a whole bunch of chickens that we can make into food. This will also be useful for a later thing that we're not quite ready to do yet. I wouldn't recommend fighting these things on slabs. Sometimes they spawn under it and go into the void, and then you lose out on some chicken, but I forgot to not do that, so yeah. When you use the witch gate pearl, it will summon one witch, then after you kill that 2 witches, and then after you kill those 3. It will loop like this until you either run out of time or knock a witch off the edge. That's why I wouldn't worry about barricading yourself in. If one happens to fall off, you'll still get the pearl back, and eventually you'll have a lot of ender pearls and earth shards anyway. Upon finishing the third round, the portal will collapse and drop a lot of loot, and then it'll form a new portal and start again, but make sure to get all of that loot from when the third round clears. Light a demon's dream fruit on fire to create a spirit fire. This is a special purple fire that won't go out. Then, throw some sand in it to get soul sand. There are a number of useful recipes using this method, but with the soul sand, we can then light that on fire and get a soul fire, as you would in vanilla. This one also won't burn out on its own, thankfully. And in order to use this for processing, we're going to have to start making structures around it. The first component you'll need is to get some soul powder. This is done by throwing some glowstone dust into the soul fire to get 2 soul powder per glowstone. I went ahead and crafted some water wheels and then set up a space for them to run. This is going to be what powers my create stuff automatically for a while, though I'm going to have to turn them off, as in this mod pack water wheels have durability. This is to dissuade you from setting up 40 billion water wheels for your power system and doing absolutely nothing else that's actually interesting. Water wheels only take durability ticks when they're doing useful work. This means that if you put a clutch up against the edge of the water wheels, they're not going to be transmitting their energy anywhere, and so they'll actually last until you need to use them again. Just make sure you actually remember to turn them off. They do go much slower than the hand crank though, so you're going to want to speed it up with some gear ratios if you want to get that going faster. The next major step is going to involve a mixing cauldron. However, we don't quite have the infrastructure to make use of it yet. That being said, it might as well be crafted now instead of later. Sifting soul sand nets nether quartz. This means that we'll be able to make anything that requires quartz, which is a lot of stuff in the near future. Something you should definitely get used to doing is, like I said before, maximizing your stress units. So, what's going to happen is that the water wheels are all going to degrade while you're doing all these one-time crafts. We want to avoid this. But what's something that we're always in need of and makes use of stuff that's already on this line of stress units? Our sifters, of course. Because we have so much gravel and dirt, we can make sure that those chests are pretty much always loaded with at least a few stacks of each. This means that no matter what, if those sifters are on, we'll be making use of the stress units that are being generated by sifting for more resources. By loading the basin with some of those copper shards we get from gravel, we can turn it into raw copper. That can then be smelted into copper ingots. Also, if you didn't know, if you press K while hovering over an item that can be crafted in the inventory, like a 2x2 of just that one item, it will compress it for you. This is useful for rocks, pebbles, clumps of dirt, and all those other things. Combining all the iron, copper, nether quartz, and redstone, and some other miscellaneous things, we can make the Peat generator, which is the first RF or FE generator in this mod pack. It'll handle a lot of your early game power needs and is one of your few options. There will be another option a little bit off, but I think this one is easier to automate and mass produce. The next thing I'll need to set up to get the Peat generator running is a squeezer. This operates by having an entity jump on it, and that downward force squeezes the item. It can then be reset with a redstone signal. In this case, I'm just going to jump on it myself and use a pressure plate to reset it. There's a method to use armor stands to automatically run the squeezer, and we'll get to that when we get to that, but for right now I'm just going to do it manually. You could use whatever redstone reset you want, but the pressure plate is probably the easiest of the options you have available to you. It's finally time to get to making some machines and using them. By making the melter, I can melt things down like biomass. So, by making some biomass, which I prepared in the mixer with some coal dust and some bone meal, we can melt that into this biomass liquid. Let the internal energy buffer fill a bit. The peat will show you how much time it has left to generate. Regular peat makes 40 RF per tick. The enriched peat makes 80 per tick. Make sure there's a bit of an energy buffer in your slow melter 9000. It's not that slow, just the name. And to get more efficiency out of it early on, you might want to pack some seeds in there instead of using up more biomass, because more biomass means more stepping on coal. The last ingredient for this recipe is blackstone. You can get that simply by haunting cobblestone, which is just by blowing a fan with the soul fire towards the depot with items on it. When working with the mixing cauldron, it's often beneficial to put in 2 stacks of input fluid instead of just 1. This allows the remaining fluid to be transformed into something else. This is the only way you'll get any extra fluid out of it, and you'll see that in a minute with a different recipe. With the blood sigil we just crafted, you can put that in the other slot in the mixing cauldron, and then start jumping in it to start producing blood. There's an artifact that extends your durability time, so if you happen to pick that up from a mimic like I did, you can spend less HP to get more blood into the mixing cauldron. I want 2 buckets of blood in here, because I'm going to be using that to produce lava. There's a recipe that has 8 stone to a rock, and you might think, well, that's a bad recipe, isn't it? No, if you have that extra blood in there, it'll get converted into 1 bucket of lava, which will be very useful for making a cobblestone generator. I'm skipping ceramic buckets entirely because I can just make them out of iron plates. This means that I can get right into making a cobblestone generator from the bucket of lava I produced in the mixing cauldron and some water that's just lying around. So as if it wasn't already easy enough to get cobblestone with the compacted cobble, I can now use this to get even more cobble automatically. The last thing we're going to do is make the super cooler. This machine takes liquid and items and will process them into another item. Much like the melter, it runs off of RF power, and it's kind of a counterpart to it. There are many useful recipes in this machine. Some of them are required for progression, some aren't but are just useful to have, and some I guess are just kinda there. The first thing I'd like to do with it is make some enriched peat. Enriched peat is a better form of peat that produces more energy in the peat generator, and that basically doubles your power output, which is very good this early on. But I'll get more into what utilities this has next time. For now, we're just gonna leave things off here. So, I thank you for watching. This has been Pick. I'm glad to have seen you, and I hope to see you again.